I had finally found my sanctuary, a small lake cabin tucked away from the chaos of the city. The water shimmered under the afternoon sun, and the smell of pine clung to the air like a comforting blanket. The gentle lap of waves against the dock was almost therapeutic. For months, this had been my escape, my little corner of peace, until Karen entered my life. You know the type, HOA Karen, the self-appointed ruler of the neighborhood, the one who measures the distance of your mailbox from the curb with a ruler and keeps a secret notebook of every lawn ornament in sight. I'd seen her passive-aggressive letters before, the kind that threaten fines over nothing, but usually I laughed them off. She had a knack for turning the most trivial things into a federal-level crisis. But this time, I could feel the storm brewing like a thundercloud over a quiet lake. The first warning came on a Friday afternoon. Karen appeared out of nowhere, striding down the path to my cabin, oversized sunglasses shielding her eyes and a stack of papers clutched like a weapon. She looked like someone about to declare war. "You're violating HOA rules," she barked before I could even greet her. I blinked at her, stunned. Her list of complaints was absurd. She scolded me for the dock being too close to the water, for planting illegal flowers along the shoreline, and, unbelievably, for my unauthorized use of water. I wanted to ask if she had also checked the fish for permits. Each accusation felt more ridiculous than the last. I had to fight the urge to laugh. She left in a huff, muttering something about calling the cops if I didn't comply immediately. I sat on my dock, staring at the lake, trying to calm my nerves. My sanctuary was suddenly feeling like the epicenter of a neighborhood war. Every ripple in the water seemed to mock me, and I couldn't help imagining Karen on the phone, reporting my crimes, with the fervor of a detective uncovering a major heist. I knew the sheriff would show up eventually. After all, Karen had no subtlety. And honestly, part of me was curious to see how this would play out. I'd watched enough HOA drama unfold from a safe distance to know that Karen thrived on chaos, and now she had set her sights on me. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, painting the lake with fiery streaks of orange and red, I felt the tension building. I leaned back on the wooden dock, the legs of my chair barely touching the water, and let the quiet moment soothe me. But deep down, I knew the peace was temporary. Karen was relentless, and the next few days were going to test every ounce of my patience. I thought about all the little absurdities of HOA life, the ridiculous rules about trash cans, the obsessive inspections of mailbox alignment, the way neighbors whispered about improperly painted shutters. And yet, there was a strange satisfaction in knowing I wasn't about to be bullied quietly. Something inside me buzzed with anticipation. If Karen thought she could rattle me, she had another thing coming. As the first stars began to blink over the lake, I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't just sit back and let her ruin my weekend. I'd face whatever she brought to my doorstep head-on. Little did I know, the sheriff was already on his way, and by the end of this weekend, the tables would turn in ways even I couldn't imagine. I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest, and watched the water. The lake was calm, serene, and soon, it would become the stage for one of the most ridiculous, dramatic, and oddly satisfying confrontations of my life. HOA Karen had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds, the lake sparkling under the early sun, and a sinking feeling in my stomach. Karen hadn't just threatened me, she had followed through on her plan. Somewhere out there, she was dialing her phone, summoning the local authorities like a commander calling in an over my little slice of paradise. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that the sheriff would probably see reason. After all, this was my property, my lake cabin, and every law on my side said I was in the right. But as the hours ticked by, the tension became unbearable. Every car on the dirt road felt like it could be the sheriff rolling in. Every sound in the woods, the rustle of leaves, a branch snapping, made me jump. Then around noon, I heard it, the distinct sound of a police cruiser's siren, faint but unmistakable, echoing across the lake. My heart rate spiked. I grabbed my jacket and stepped onto the dock, squinting at the road. The sheriff's SUV pulled up, tires crunching on gravel, and for a brief moment I felt relief. Maybe this would be a simple conversation. Maybe reason would prevail. Of course, Karen couldn't let that happen. She appeared on the side of the road like a storm cloud with legs, waving her stack of papers, her voice carrying over the water. "Sheriff, you have to do something," she yelled, pointing at me as if I were a criminal mastermind plotting from my dock. The sheriff stepped out, calm and collected, hands resting casually on his belt. He looked at Karen for a moment, expression unreadable. And then he looked at me, gave a small nod, and I felt a flicker of hope. He seemed like someone who knew these petty HOA battles inside out, and maybe, just maybe, he would see the absurdity of Karen's claims. Karen launched into her full performance. The waving of arms, the dramatic gasps, the finger-pointing accusations about illegal dock modifications, unauthorized landscaping, and most ridiculously, using the lake water for personal gain. I watched as the sheriff patiently listened, flipping through the papers she shoved at him. He raised an eyebrow at one point, and I swear I saw the tiniest smirk. I couldn't help but chuckle quietly. There was something almost theatrical about the way Karen carried herself, as though she were auditioning for a reality TV show about neighborhood tyrants. But beneath the humor, my nerves were on edge. The sheriff was and I had no idea which way he would swing. Karen's performance escalated. She leaned in close to the sheriff, whispering urgently about bylaws, violations, and the supposed moral decay of my lakefront activities. I almost expected her to produce a dramatic or a PowerPoint presentation titled, "How John is Ruining Our Neighborhood." The sheriff remained calm, flipping slowly through the HOA documents she handed him, reading each clause as though he were savoring a fine wine. He didn't say much, just nodded occasionally, taking his time. And then, he looked up at Karen. His face was unreadable, but there was a weight in his eyes, a subtle authority that made it clear he wasn't buying a single word she said. Karen's face faltered for the first time. Her confident, self-righteous demeanor cracked ever so slightly. She tried to argue, tried to inject more drama, but the sheriff raised a hand, stopping her mid-rant. I felt a rush of anticipation. Something was about to happen, and I could tell Karen wasn't ready for it. As the sheriff took a step back and began making a call on his radio, I leaned against the railing of my dock, trying to keep my composure. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, but part of me couldn't stop grinning. I had a feeling the next few minutes were going to turn this petty HOA showdown into something unforgettable. And just like that, the scene froze in my mind. The calm lake, the morning sun glinting off the water, Karen flailing, and the sheriff standing there, a man who clearly wasn't impressed. I knew in that moment that the tables were about to turn. Little did I know, by the time the sheriff was done with his calls and paperwork, Karen would be facing something she didn't see coming, something far worse than a warning letter or a fine. The sheriff stood there calmly, flipping through Karen's stack of papers like they were nothing more than grocery receipts. I leaned against the railing of my dock, trying to hide the grin tugging at my lips. I knew HOA Karen thrived on theatrics, but this sheriff, he was a different breed. He wasn't intimidated, he wasn't amused, and most importantly, he wasn't going to let her run the show. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she was about to explode. Her sunglasses had slipped down her nose, revealing eyes wide with disbelief. "You have to do something, he's breaking the rules," she pleaded, voice rising an octave. I bit back a laugh. This was her full "I am the law" performance, complete with dramatic hand gestures that could have doubled as dance. The sheriff finally looked up from the papers, fixing Karen with a level gaze. "Ma'am," he said slowly, deliberately, "these documents, they don't actually give you the authority you think they do." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She opened it again, trying to speak, but no words came out. She tried waving the papers in his face, pointing at me as if to say, "See, see." The sheriff remained unmoved, and I could almost feel her frustration radiating across the dock. I shifted my weight, pretending to check the water, but inside I was buzzing with anticipation. The sheriff wasn't just reading papers, he was dismantling Karen's entire case, clause by clause, with a calmness that made her rage look silly. Every time she tried to interrupt, he politely, firmly, and almost humorously reminded her that she needed to let him finish. And then came the moment I'd been quietly hopping for. The sheriff looked at me, nodding slightly, and said, "You're within your rights here. In fact, the HOA is violating a few of its own rules with these complaints." Karen's face went pale. I swear the color drained from her cheeks like water through a sieve. Her lips trembled, and for the first time she seemed small. The power she'd wielded over the neighborhood, the way she strutted around like the ultimate authority, was crumbling before my eyes. But she wasn't done yet. Karen puffed out her chest and tried again. That's not how the law works. You can't just ignore." The sheriff raised a single finger, halting her mid-sentence. He didn't yell, he didn't argue. He just stood there, calm, deliberate, and utterly unbothered by her theatrics. There was a quiet authority in his presence, the kind that commands attention without demanding it. I could feel Karen shrinking with every passing second. I couldn't help thinking how poetic it was. Here she was, the neighborhood tyrant, who made a career out of threatening neighbors over trivial rules, now silenced by a man who simply knew the law. It was satisfying in a way I didn't even know I needed. The sheriff leaned back, hands on his hips, and gave Karen a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "I suggest you review these rules carefully before making any more complaints," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. Karen opened her mouth again, probably to argue, but the sheriff simply turned to me, giving a nod that said, "You're clear." I tried to act casual, but my pulse was racing. The tension in the air was electric, a mix of relief and amusement. Karen fumed silently, her stack of papers now limp in her hands. I could tell she was trying to formulate her next move, but whatever it was, she had underestimated the one person who mattered: the law. As the sheriff walked back to his SUV, Karen called out something about appeals and neighbors watching, but the sheriff didn't even look back. I laughed quietly to myself, sinking into the relief that, for now, the battle was mine. The calm lake, the gentle ripples on the water, and the soft hum of the wind in the trees felt like a reward for surviving the absurd storm Karen had brought to my doorstep. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Karen didn't give up easily. She never did. And somehow, I had a feeling the next move she made would be even more outrageous. The sheriff didn't rush. He never did. I watched him lean against the hood of his SUV, squinting at the stack of HOA documents Karen had handed him like they were a toddler's scribbles. Karen hovered nervously beside him, muttering about violations and unauthorized activities, but her usual thunderous confidence was gone. She looked like someone trying to light a campfire in the rain, futile and increasingly desperate. I stayed on the dock, pretending to check the water, but my eyes were glued to the scene. Every once in a while, I caught Karen glancing at me, as if she expected me to burst into guilt or panic. Newsflash, I wasn't even close. The sheriff flipped a page, then another, each movement slow and deliberate. It felt like he was savoring the absurdity of the situation. Finally, he looked up at Karen, voice calm, almost conversational, yet cutting through the tension like a knife. "These rules," he said, tapping the document, "don't actually give you the authority to demand removal of personal property or to call law enforcement for non-issues." Karen's jaw dropped. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. I could see the gears turning. She was trying to figure out if she could argue, bluff, or cry her way out of it. Nothing. The sheriff wasn't flinching. I couldn't resist. Did you want a chair?" I called out, half teasing. "You look exhausted from all that dramatic exertion." Karen whipped around, glaring daggers, but the sheriff just smirked faintly. That tiny expression, barely noticeable, was enough to make Karen's fury simmer even hotter. I almost laughed out loud. Then the sheriff did something unexpected. He pulled out a yellow legal folder and started reading passages aloud, slowly, clearly enjoying every word. "According to Section 12, subsection B, paragraph 4, he began, and I had to stifle a laugh at Karen's horrified expression. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She had no clue what was coming. Every clause he read seemed to chip away at her confidence. My dock chair creaked as I leaned forward, fully invested. The sheriff had discovered a loophole, a glaring, almost comical oversight in the HOA's own rules that Karen had been banking on. And now, he was explaining it to her. "You see," the sheriff said, "not only is the complaint invalid, but repeated misuse of these rules by a board member, someone in your position, can actually constitute a violation of HOA regulations themselves." Karen's eyes widened. I could see the panic beginning to settle in. She sputtered something about interpretation and intent, but the sheriff wasn't buying it. His calm tone, the deliberate pace, and that faint smirk combined to make her look like a child caught sneaking cookies from the jar. I felt a surge of vindication. Finally, after months of dealing with her petty letters and passive-aggressive memos, I was watching her unravel in real time. It wasn't malicious. It was justice, simple and poetic. And just when I thought she might try a desperate last-ditch move, the sheriff leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "If you continue down this path, ma'am, you could be the one facing consequences." Karen froze, frozen mid-step, the papers trembling in her hands. For the first time, I saw her lose control completely. She had spent so long playing the neighborhood dictator, thinking that fear and intimidation were her weapons, and now she was disarmed. I grinned, taking a slow sip of coffee and letting the tension settle. The lake reflected the sky perfectly, as if nothing could touch this little slice of paradise. But behind me, Karen was quietly fuming, calculating, and plotting. I knew the sheriff hadn't left yet, and I had a feeling the next moments would be the real turning point of this ridiculous standoff. The calm before the storm was over. What came next would decide whether HOA Karen would finally learn her lesson or continue her endless crusade against common sense. The sheriff closed the folder with a quiet snap that sounded louder than it had any right to. Karen's expression flickered between outrage and disbelief. I had never seen someone look so small while standing upright. She was usually the neighborhood general, barking orders and wielding HOA rules like a sword, but now, she was the one on the defensive. "You see," the sheriff said calmly, "the HOA itself is in violation of its own bylaws, and repeated attempts to enforce rules you're not authorized to enforce could result in legal consequences for the board." Karen's mouth opened. Nothing came out. She waved her arms like she was trying to summon the correct words from thin air. I leaned back against the railing of my dock, secretly savoring every second. It was almost surreal. All her bluster, all her dramatic threats, and now she was helpless. I felt a thrill run through me. The tables had turned, and I could almost hear the little voice inside my head whispering, "Justice tastes than coffee on a lake morning." Karen, of course, wasn't ready to admit defeat. That's not fair, you can't just." Her protests trailed off as the sheriff cut in, calm but firm. "The law is clear. You cannot enforce rules beyond your authority, and attempts to do so can result in penalties against you personally." Her eyes darted between me and the sheriff. I could almost see the panic brewing. She had spent months cultivating fear in the neighborhood, sending letters, calling meetings, whispering to neighbors, and here she was, facing the quiet, unshakable authority of the law and losing. I cleared my throat, trying to act casual, though my hands were shaking with a mix of adrenaline and amusement. Sheriff," I said, keeping my voice light, "does this mean she, might be in trouble?" The sheriff gave me a faint nod, his eyes still locked on Karen. "It's already in motion," he said. That small statement hit Karen like a punch to the gut. Her face paled, and she gripped her papers like a lifeline. I felt my pulse racing, not with fear, but with the thrill of witnessing the absolute reversal of power. Karen had thrived on intimidation, on making her neighbors feel small and powerless, and now every ounce of that energy was backfiring. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. How do I spin this? How do I save face? But there was no saving face today. Not with the sheriff standing there, calm, authoritative, and utterly unimpressed by her theatrics. Every time she opened her mouth, he shut her down with a single, measured phrase, each one cutting through her arguments like a scalpel. At one point, She lunged forward, waving her hands, probably trying to appeal to his sense of mercy. The sheriff didn't flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow, and I swear I saw her shrink by a good 6 inches in a single motion. The lake was quiet except for the faint lapping of waves against the dock. It was almost poetic. My little cabin, the calm water, and Karen, the neighborhood tyrant, reduced to a quivering shadow of herself. I leaned back, taking a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. This wasn't just a victory over a petty HOA president. It was a moment of vindication for every ridiculous, unnecessary rule she'd ever tried to enforce. And then came the moment that made the entire ordeal worth it. The sheriff pulled a fresh piece of paper from his folder, held it up, and said, "Ma'am, you are hereby issued a notice of violations for repeated misuse of HOA authority. Consider this your official warning." Karen froze. She blinked rapidly, then muttered something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like unbelievable. She had no more words, no more dramatic gestures, just stunned silence. I couldn't help it. I laughed quietly to myself, the sound mingling with the gentle slap of waves on the shore. The tables had not just turned, they had flipped completely. For the first time in a long time, I felt a wave of relief. My sanctuary was safe, the law was on my side, and HOA Karen had learned, in the most dramatic way possible, that her reign of terror had limits. Of course, I knew she wouldn't disappear quietly. Karen never did. But for now, the lake was calm, the sheriff was leaving, and I could finally breathe again. The first victory had been won, and the rest of this weekend was shaping up to be even. I thought Part 5 was satisfying. I thought watching Karen fumble and sputter under the sheriff's calm authority was the peak of petty HOA justice. But I was wrong. Part 6 was about to take the whole situation to a level I didn't even imagine. The sheriff turned back toward Karen, who was now clutching her papers like a life raft. Her confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced with panic and confusion. He reached into his folder again and pulled out a crisp official document, stamped and signed. He held it up, and my stomach twisted with anticipation. "This," he said, his voice steady and deliberate, "is a formal eviction notice issued against you for repeated violations of HOA rules that you yourself were supposed to enforce." Karen froze. Her lips parted, but no words came out. I swear I saw her jaw twitch. The papers she had clutched like weapons now looked like nothing more than scrap, useless in the face of the law. I could hardly believe what was happening. The neighborhood tyrant, the woman who had terrorized lawns, mailboxes, and my peaceful lake cabin, was now facing consequences for her own actions. And the best part, I was standing there, perfectly legal, perfectly calm, and completely vindicated. Karen tried to protest, her voice cracking. This can't be real, Her words faltered under the sheriff's unwavering gaze. She waved her hands, probably hoping the document would magically disappear, but it didn't. It sat there, official, undeniable, and very, very real. The sheriff handed the notice directly to her. She took it like someone had handed her a live grenade. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it, scanning every word. I watched her face contort, first in disbelief, then in fury, and finally in silent resignation. This wasn't a fine she could ignore, this wasn't a letter she could shred, this was a legally binding eviction notice, and there was nothing she could do about it. I tried to keep my composure, but a small laugh escaped me. It was poetic justice in its form. All those times she had threatened neighbors over trivial rules, all the petty letters, the calls, the imagined moral authority, every ounce of it had come crashing down. And it had come down spectacularly, right in front of my eyes. Karen's protests had dwindled to whispers. She muttered something about appeals and legal loopholes, but the sheriff simply shook his head, each movement calm and deliberate, like he was dismissing a child's tantrum. I could feel the satisfaction settling into my chest. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a moment of poetic irony that I'd never forget. The woman who tried to control everyone's life had just been handed a taste of her own medicine. The lake was calm again, reflecting the late afternoon sun like nothing had happened. But behind me, Karen was shaking with frustration. Every step she took away from the cabin seemed heavy, burdened with the weight of a reality she hadn't anticipated. I took a deep breath, savoring the quiet, knowing that for once, my sanctuary truly felt safe. The sheriff gave me a nod before heading back to his vehicle. "Enjoy your weekend," he said with a faint smile. "I'd make sure she reads the fine print if I were you." And with that, he drove off, leaving Karen staring at the lake like someone who had just realized they were outmatched by reality itself. I laughed quietly to myself, watching her stomp off, papers flapping in the wind. The ultimate showdown had ended, and the victory was mine. My cabin, my lake, and my peace had survived the storm. HOA Karen had been humbled, and I could finally breathe. But I knew one thing: she wasn't going to disappear quietly. Karen never did. Still, for now, the lake was mine, the sheriff had done his part, and I could finally enjoy the calm I had fought so hard to protect. The rest of this weekend was going to be mine, and I intended to savor every second. The next morning, the lake was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But the neighborhood was buzzing like a beehive on overdrive. Word travels fast in HOA circles, and apparently, Karen's epic defeat had already become the hottest topic on every street, cul-de-sac, and online forum in our subdivision. I sipped my coffee on the dock, feeling a mix of relief and amusement. I could hear distant murmurs of gossip, neighbors whispering about the showdown that had unfolded right here on my property. I even caught sight of a few familiar faces peeking from behind curtains, probably hopping to catch a glimpse of the vanquished HOA queen. Karen, predictably, was having the hardest time saving face. She wandered the streets, muttering under her breath, waving her eviction notice like it was a warning label she didn't understand. Every neighbor who passed her glanced with subtle smirks, trying not to laugh outright. I couldn't blame them. It was a sight to behold. The mighty HOA Karen, reduced to awkward stumbles and desperate explanations. I stayed out of the fray, letting her humiliation play out. There was a strange satisfaction in watching someone so full of themselves finally meet the consequences of their actions. For months, she had wielded her tiny bit of authority like a weapon, and now the irony was than any revenge I could have orchestrated myself. But of course, Karen wasn't ready to admit defeat entirely. I noticed her packing back and forth near the community clubhouse, likely plotting her next move. Maybe she was planning another letter, another phone call, or another ridiculous complaint. One thing was certain: Karen never gives up. Meanwhile, I enjoyed my peace. I walked along the dock, watching the sunlight dance across the lake, reflecting on the absurdity of the past few days. Who knew that fighting an HOA could feel like an epic showdown? I laughed quietly at the memory of Karen's dramatic flailing, the sheriff's calm authority, and the way the tables had turned so spectacularly in my favor. Neighbors began to approach me cautiously, some curious, some amused, all whispering about the events of the previous day. I played it cool, offering polite nods and vague smiles, letting them fill in the details on their own. After all, sometimes it's more satisfying to let people imagine the chaos than to explain it. I even heard one neighbor whispering to another, "Did you see her face when the sheriff handed her the eviction notice? Priceless." I couldn't help but grin. Yes, priceless was exactly the word. It had been a theatrical, poetic, and completely deserved moment of justice. Still, I kept my guard up. Karen was unpredictable, and I had learned never to underestimate her. She might sulk today, but tomorrow she could try something even more outrageous. HOA tyrants have a stubborn streak that borders on delusional, and she was no exception. By late afternoon, the neighborhood had mostly returned to normal, but the legend of Karen's defeat lingered. It felt almost surreal. I leaned back on my dock chair, letting the gentle breeze wash over me, and realized something important. Sometimes, standing up for yourself is worth the chaos. Sometimes, justice comes in unexpected forms, with a calm sheriff and a perfectly timed legal loophole. And as I watched the lake shimmer in the fading sunlight, I couldn't help but think that, for now, my sanctuary was safe. Karen had been humbled, the neighborhood had witnessed it, and I could finally relax. Well, at least until she tried her next ridiculous scheme. But for today, the battle was over. I had won, the lake was calm, and the peace I had fought to protect was finally restored. And honestly, it felt better than I ever could have imagined. The weekend had finally settled into a quiet rhythm, and for the first time in days, my lake cabin felt truly peaceful. The water shimmered in the late afternoon sun, the pine trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the only sound was the soft slap of waves against the dock. For once, I could relax without glancing over my shoulder, wondering what petty complaint HOA Karen would cook up next. I sat on my dock, coffee in hand, replaying the events of the past 48 hours. Karen had stormed, ranted, and sputtered her way through her final attempt at intimidation, only to be met with calm authority and ultimately legal reality. The sheriff's intervention, the loophole in the HOA rules, the eviction notice, it had all been perfectly orchestrated by fate, or maybe just by the fact that I wasn't afraid to stand my ground. Neighbors wandered past cautiously, some smiling, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Word of Karen's defeat had spread like wildfire, and the whispers were impossible to ignore. I even caught a few knowing winks and discreet thumbs-ups from folks who had suffered under her reign for years. There was a shared, unspoken satisfaction in knowing the neighborhood had collectively witnessed the downfall of its self-appointed tyrant. Karen herself was nowhere in sight. I could imagine her at home, packing the living room, muttering to herself, and drafting yet another absurd plan to reclaim her power. But the difference now was that she had officially been humbled. Her authority had evaporated in the face of the law, and every move she made from this point on would carry the weight of her public defeat. I laughed quietly, thinking about how ridiculous it all had been. The letters, the meetings, the calls to the sheriff, all over my peaceful lake cabin. Yet in the midst of that absurdity, there was a lesson I couldn't ignore. Standing up for yourself matters. Sometimes, the right people show up at the right time, and the chaos of confrontation can reveal truths that no amount of yelling, threatening, or bullying can change. I watched the sun dip lower, casting golden streaks across the lake. For the first time in weeks, the cabin felt like mine again, not just legally but emotionally. The peace I had sought here was no longer threatened by petty HOA politics or Karen's inflated sense of power. It was mine to enjoy, fully and without guilt. And yet a part of me knew that Karen wasn't gone. HOA tyrants rarely disappear quietly. She would probably be plotting, scheming, and whispering behind closed doors, trying to find some way to regain control. But I also knew this. Whatever she tried, the sheriff had made it clear that the law and common sense were on my side. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp lake air fill my lungs, and smiled. This was more than just a victory over a single neighbor. It was a small triumph over unnecessary rules, over intimidation, and over anyone who believed they could control someone else's life with nothing but fear. As the stars began to appear overhead, I leaned back and let the calm wash over me. My dock, my cabin, my lake, it was all mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a profound sense of contentment. I laughed softly to myself, imagining Karen reading her eviction notice one more time, muttering about unfairness, while the neighborhood quietly shook its head in collective amusement. The weekend stretched ahead, full of potential and freedom. I could fish, read, nap, or just sit quietly on the dock, watching the water shimmer under the moonlight. The lake had survived HOA Karen, and I had survived her chaos. More than that, I had learned that sometimes, standing firm and trusting the law is all it takes to turn a nightmare into a story worth telling. I took one last sip of coffee, watching the reflection of the stars dance on the calm water. The battle was over, the victory complete, and my sanctuary, my little corner of the world, was finally blissfully mine. And somewhere in the distance, I could swear I heard the faint mutter of Karen, still plotting. But that was her problem now, not mine. For tonight, the lake was mine. The cabin was mine. And my peace, hard-won and well-deserved, was finally, undeniably mine. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.